Good afternoon. I'm Katsuichi Uchida, President of USJI, US-Japan Research Institute, as well as the Vice President of Waseda University, one of the five founding member universities. And USJI was established in April 2009, now organized by 8 leading Japanese universities, and also financially supported by business society of both the United States and Japan. Our mission is to dispatch policy-related research results and policy recommendations on global issues to both the United States and Japanese audiences. We have continuously held USJI Week twice a year in March and September. As the establishment of USJI and during the last 6 years, we have changed Prime Minister almost every year. However, nowadays, coalition of the Liberal Democratic Party and Kome Party held a supermajority in both upper and lower houses, and therefore political stability was restored, and many people prospect current administration will probably last at least several years, and people expect in growth and recovery. This week, under these changed political, economic, and social background, we have the 10th USJI Week from yesterday, Wednesday, to Monday next week. This week's seminars and events cover diverse topics, and I'm confident that these seminars will satisfy the needs and expectations of researchers, academics, and policymakers, and people in general. This afternoon, we are fortunate to have a symposium on the topics of how can the Obama and Abe administration manage multiple FTAs to promote common prosperity in the Asia Pacific. Beyond the seminars, I would like to get the permissions of the speakers and audience for recording these seminars and using the video through our website. And also, this seminar is co-hosted by Brookings institutions and Waseda University Organization for Japan-US Studies. And also, this symposium is granted by Center for Global Partnership, the Japan Foundation. Well, I'd like to welcome our moderator, Professor Terada.
Thank you very much, Professor Uchida. Very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you here for coming all the way to join us this afternoon. I know any session, any presentation soon after lunch is always difficult, not only for the speakers, also audiences as well. I'm particularly feeling so after eating too much American fried potatoes just downstairs. But we try our best to keep you awake. Just following the morning session, which focused upon the more political, strategic, and security issues covering the US-Japan relations, as well as the wider Asia-Pacific region, we decided to try to focus more upon a political economy of the same issues, with particular attention could be given to the regional integrations, or FTA, free trade agreements, or political economics concerning the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. In this case, we have very good the distinguished scholar from Japan and the US for this panel. And first, Dr. Miria Soris, and the Japan chair at Brookings Institution, and also associate professor at American University here at Washington. Well, she has been working on the Japan, particularly trade policy, as well as the regional integration approaches. But after moving to Brookings, and she has been quite quoted by Japanese media, particularly to carry the American perspectives on the trade issues, including the TPPs. And Professor Masahiko Genma, professor from the School of Social Sciences at Waseda University, is working on the agricultural environment, sometimes web economics. And well, we have been working together for many years, and both of the speakers centering on the issues related to the US-Japan at the Waseda University for US-Japan Studies or WUJS. So as Professor Shida mentioned in the beginning, this seminar series has been jointly organized by Brookings Institution as well as the Waseda Organization for US-Japan Studies or WUJS. Well, my name is Takashi Terada. Well, actually, I used to be working for Waseda University, but I just moved to Dosha University in Kyoto, Japan last April. Even after moving to Kyoto, I have been, well, quite fortunately, getting the chance to work for the WUJS. And so in this case, this is the fifth appearance for USJI myself. Okay, as I mentioned, this is the so-called the morning and the afternoon session, two series of sessions for the Brookings WUJS seminar series. As I mentioned also, our session is more on politics and economics on regional integration. And format is as follows. I myself try to briefly describe the themes or agendas, and which might be probably covering the whole issues of this afternoon session. So I have probably 20 minutes for this. And followed by Dr. Soris, and then Dr. Genma. And I try to sketch relatively broader the issues or pictures covering the US-Japan in terms of regional integration issues, including TPP, and we are probably touching upon just narrowing the so-called mega type of the regional institutions or integrations, hopefully with some more American or non-Japanese perspectives. And Professor Genma picks up the very specific but very significant issues on regional integration in terms of rule making rather than the market access or trade liberalization issues. And from economics viewpoint, probably each had 20 minutes for presentations, followed by hopefully more active Q&As. Again, unlike the morning sessions, we have nothing to do with the government or government agencies. So now, interestingly, after heavyweights presented speaker just got out of this room together with a lot of cameras, TV cameras, so there's no TV cameras here. So we are feeling quite comfortable in this case, and to make more controversial in a sense or advocative presentations. So let me start my own part of the responsibility for this session. Well, what I'd like to say is sort of the transformation in Asia Pacific, especially in terms of regional integration. So I just divided the last 10 decades of the activities in relation to regional integration into two parts. One, first stage, no regional integration, even in 2000. That sounds funny, but when it comes to regional, actually regional integration negotiations have never happened before the TPP actually started negotiation in 2010. But before that, we have quite a number of the different initiatives, even on regional settings, which probably we could say regional cooperation or dialogues for promoting or laying foundation for the subsequent regional integration negotiations. For example, this is sort of the preparatory meeting period, where I just described all the APEC to the ASEAN plus 3. ASEAN means, well, 10 Southeast Asian countries, plus Japan, China, South Korea. We call it APT in abbreviation. Established in 1997 in the midst of the Asian French crisis in Malaysia. And followed by ASEAN plus 3. And the first meeting was also held in Kuala Lumpur in 2005. Well, currently, it's named EAS, and East Asian Summit, to which the United States and Russia joined in 2011. So well, we have ASEAN plus 8. But when it comes to regional integration, still United States and Russia haven't shown any interest in joining this East Asian framework. So therefore, I stick to the membership as M+6 in describing East Asian framework. And then new APEC. Why we have to say old and new? Old is sort of the based upon what we call open regionalism. Open means if liberalization happens within region, it should be applied to the outside, like EU. But I believe this is not integration. And to be frank, it's never happened with an APEC framework. Then now, APEC took the new initiative, new norm, which means quite traditional approach to regional integration, as have been seen in Europe or other regions, even Latin America, Mercosur, even Southeast Asia after, etc. So it is quite, the interesting, the transition from the so-called ideal type of regional integration, which Japan particularly too much pushed for future regional integration in the Pacific, but it was unfortunately frustrated. And now United States showed interest in utilizing the APEC framework for attaining its agendas and norms. So it's called New APEC. I've seen realization of FTA, free trade area in the Asia-Pacific, pushed by the Bush administration, and also now TPP. But during this period, only bilateral FTA had been proliferated until TPP negotiations started in March 2010 in Melbourne, Australia. And then second stage, this is the beginning of the stage 2, regional integration began. TPP 2010, and CJK, it's abbreviation of China, Japan, Korea, for trilateral cooperation. We have now Secretariat in Seoul for Trilateral Cooperation Secretariat. 17 or 18 ministerial meetings already set up. And one of the most significant issues is actually to promote the CJK free trade agreement for Northeast Asia integration. And the RCP, or RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, but this is so-called SM+6 FTA, initially proposed by Japan, particularly METI in 2006. And now, just explained later on, China made concessions by giving up the +3 frameworks and coming to make the Japanese proposal, and then culminating in RCP. And CJK RCP negotiations started just this year. But CJK has just one official negotiation, and RCEP had 2, compared with TPP with 19 negotiations. I heard in Washington DC here we'll have this month, and there's negotiations followed by October in Indonesia for TPP summit. So I just said the domino effect. Again, this is not a topic for me to concentrate for this seminar, but it seems to me the FTA proliferation can be sometimes explained by so-called domino effect. One nation, if they went first to have FTA with major countries, other regional countries also try to follow this kind of trend. So in this case, FTA has been proliferated. And this can be probably proved by looking at what happened in the first stage of bilateral relationships, or bilateral FTAs. But it seems to me it has been also applicable to the case of the domino effect of regional integration frameworks. So this is sort of the topic. Well, this page has just explained what kind of bilateral FTAs can be observed in the first stage. Japan focus #1 with ASEAN individual member countries, so-called ASEAN +1 FTA, centering on ASEAN, FTA in Northeast Asia, centering on China, including Taiwan-China FTA was severe, or even China-Taiwan FTAs. Now China and Korea has been engaged in negotiations. And finally, South Korea initiated FTA with the US and EU, big non-Asian countries. So in this case, this kind of 4 types of bilateral FTA have been proliferated, initiated by different countries, different members. But my focus today is on this page, and from bilateral to multilateral domino. And actually this was initiated and caused by 2 biggest economies in the world, United States and China. And the third largest economy, which is Japan, also actually, it seems to me, engaged in this competition between China and the United States over the regional integration frameworks. And I think maintained a key position in defining the trend in the power game of regional integration. So currently, well, this is sort of the map describing the different set of regional integration frameworks. Well, circle one is based upon ASEAN with deep blue, light blue, and much lighter blue. Well, this was actually based on the ASEAN with 10 member countries, ASEAN plus 3, and ASEAN plus 6. But now I have to say plus 3, plus 6 have merged to set up RCP. You can probably see from the left side of the page. ASEAN plus 6 FTA in that case. And square one, that is sort of the TPP, just penetrating into this round frameworks of the ASEAN-based FTA framework or regional integration frameworks. Why penetrating? Because ASEAN has been divided. As you can see, Brunei, Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam have been engaged in the TPP negotiations. While Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, these big economies of Southeast Asia have been excluded. But I heard Philippines and Thailand are now showing an interest in joining it. It depends on domestic politics in both nations. But more emphasis, particularly from political security sides, have been created on behalf of two nations' interest in joining TPP subsequently, I hope. And another square one, it's just center, CJK FTA. And I just highlighted Japan in red color. And if you look at this map, you can find Japan joining most of the all regional integration framework, TPP, RCEP, and CJK. And Japan is the only nation in this country, in this region, to have 3 negotiations at hand. So I believe, from Japanese viewpoint, it's a very, very important period for the next probably couple of years to realize its own the agendas, including stimulating economies, to also pushing the more internationalizations, including the educational exchanges with the regional countries. And why I say competition? Well, probably US views has been well informed in this room, and also media might be touching upon, but China particularly viewed US commitment to TPP as motivated by checking China's growing influence in regional integration. Well, I've been to China over the last 2 years, 4 or 5 times, and attending the conferences in Beijing and Shanghai. And every time I heard this very similar kind of opinion expressed by Chinese scholars. And most of the scholars are actually associated with the government. So I would take their views as sort of representing the government's interest or views on integrations. Why Chinese people tend to think so? I think TPP is a very different type of the FTAs compared with the ones which China has pursued. Well, high standard trade arrangement suitable to the American template for FTAs, like labor, which I think Professor Gemma will be focusing much more. But for example, the labor issues in TPP just requested that all member countries to allow the labor unions to be established, particularly for wage negotiations. But given the current Chinese political situations, labor union has never been established. And some people say, no way, particularly when it comes to the state-owned companies, which actually account for more than 40% of China's overall GDP. So given only looking at this point, the China find it very, very difficult to join TPP at the moment. So what happened after that? Well, in this case, TPP, which I also described later on, in a sense dominated by US and Japan, currently 12 member countries. But except for that, relatively smaller mid-sized economies have been engaged, compared with RCEP, which China has been pushing instead. India, China, South Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, all of them are actually engaged in RCEP negotiations. So in terms of populations, well, TPP can be much, much smaller compared with the RCEP or East Asian regional frameworks. So in this case, from the American viewpoint, it seems to me Japan's participation was very, very significant And Mr. Abe came to Washington DC February this year, just soon before the USJI week in March. And I was lucky to hear a couple of the American views on the Abe-Obama meeting in February, through which Mr. Abe actually made the decision for Japan's commitment to TPP. So I think that's quite significant for so-called power game or power struggles and regional integration in Asia-Pacific region. But interestingly, this kind of movement helped China to be more flexible in terms of the regional integrations. I just picked up the 3 examples of what sort of the China's flexibility can be observable, particularly against Japan, which means in some Japan could be more encouraged by China to join a sort of the framework in which China can be more comfortable with, like CJK FTA or RCEPs. So in this case, now the US has Japan in TPP, and China also has Japan in CJK and RCEP. Of course, next strategy, particularly on behalf of Japan, is how Japan could utilize the situation in which Japan has multiple regional integrations to promote. But one issue I would like to highlight, particularly for this seminar, is I talked about the end of the bilateralism, shifting to more multilateralism in terms of regional integration. But the tricky point is still bilateralism still exists within multilateral settings. And this was mainly because of the US, particularly market access. Negotiations used to be normally done multilaterally. The one negotiation room, one member country representative come together. But when it comes to market access or trade liberalizations, it should be done, it has been done so far bilaterally. Japan has met with the 6 TPP member countries for bilateral exchange of the so-called the tariff schedules, which kind of tariffs could be reduced or eliminated on what kind of product bilaterally. So in this case, Japan's initial interest in multilateral forum was so-called the rule of origins, which is very complicated issues in terms of any FTAs. For example, I have some machine here, should be made in America, I guess. Sorry, made in China. But how you can prove this was made in China? You need certificate. And of course, the number of the parts are incorporated in this machine. Usually 40% the components were actually originated from country, for China, for example. This can be probably regarded as a Chinese product. But NAFTA, North American case, is a bit higher, 6%. It's a bit strict in this case. But if you look at the number of different FTAs, different actually rule of origins, which always makes multinational companies utilize of FTAs, not government, feeling very complicated to find out which would be best for their company's product to be exported without tariffs. That's very strategically significant, in terms of reducing market prices and overseas. But multilateral, in this case, rule of origins might be much more easily utilized. Or some countries, for example, TPP, 12 countries, if produced some parts produced in TPP member countries, assembled, no problem. So in this case, produced outside countries, but they are TPP member countries, doesn't matter. So in this case, multilateral settings is quite significant for multinational companies. But when it comes to bilateralism, the US has been pushing. Yes, it's easy to select products which could not be liberalized. For example, from US viewpoint, automobiles should be probably excluded, particularly against Japan. But maybe not so against Malaysia, Vietnam. US would be happy to eliminate 100% tariffs, no worries, because they don't produce competitive automobiles. But when it comes to Japan, probably not. US probably asked Japan to allow US companies maintain, so US government maintain the tariffs on automobiles, particularly pickup trucks, 25%, it's very, very high. So again, bilateralism and multilateralism, this is a probably issue which we have to be paying more attention to. Otherwise, companies should comply to their own countries on behalf of their own future growth. Again, time is already coming. So this is sort of the chart describing the feature of the TPP, the countries, RCP, 16 countries, and CPEC 3 countries. I know that I need probably maybe 10, 20 minutes to explain all, but only one issue. Target year, just middle. TPP 2013, this year. RCP 2015, 2.5 years more. And CJK, not sure, not announced. It depends on probably political situation of the China, Japan, Korea. I don't know. But interesting point, if 2013, this year, particularly the United States is pushing this target year on behalf of the American election, I think, coming soon, probably America needs to make a sort of concessions. Otherwise, many countries, even Japan, try to maintain their own claims, which means no compromise, which also means delayed. I think America, it seems to be finding itself in a quite difficult situation to realize its own agendas by setting up such a target year, end of this year. So in this case, RCEP is much more flexible. They can probably express more desires. And probably after joining 2015, many countries try to consider a compromise. But at the moment, RCEP hasn't got into this kind of stage yet, just pushing their own agendas, interests, quite freely. This is very different from the TPP. Of course, TPP negotiation started 2010, so already 3 years have passed since then. And the RCP had a relatively longer prepared period, but official negotiation just this year started. But I think the preparation period was quite useful in this case for creating sort of the atmosphere in which their informal opinions and information can be shared already. So this is very different, in my opinion, from the TPP's approaches. Of course, in single undertaking and etc., much more different issues can be probably highlighted, but on behalf of the probably American interest in relation to the election, to the trade negotiations, I think for target 2 years, implication might be quite significant. But thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and participate in this panel and collaborate with the US-Japan Research Institute and Waseda's Organization for Japan-US Studies. So what I want to talk about today is about the possibilities for deepening US-Japan relations in what I like to call is an era of mega trade agreements. And so many of the points that I'm going to make actually resonate quite well with what Dr. Terada was discussing. So I want to talk about, first of all, give you the context as to how much has changed in the trade front. We have very large-scale, consequential negotiations in front of us. And I think it's important to understand the very high stakes of what's going on today. And within that movement in the trade world, then I want to focus about the possibilities for deeper, stronger collaboration between the United States and Japan, and think about what are the consequences of seizing this opportunity and maximizing these opportunities, but also what are some of the challenges if we don't play this card well. All right, so let me then, first of all, explain a little more detail what I mean when I talk about mega trade agreements. I actually have been following free trade agreements, FTAs, and I have to give you an apology to begin with in the Japanese style, because probably I'm going to use a lot of acronyms. I'm going to try to use as few as I can, but this is one that now actually is, very, very much used, free trade agreements. We're talking about preferential trade negotiations that deviate from the principle of the World Trade Organization of most favored nation. And I remember when I actually started analyzing trade issues and looking at FTAs in particular, that the perception was that this was a side issue. These were small trade agreements. And the impression was, among many people, was that the center of action still was in the WTO. Well, think how far we have come from that. And now we actually wonder about what's going to be the long-term future of the WTO as a forum for negotiation. And now we're actually witnessing the emergence of very large FTAs. So I think that what's really interesting here is that up to a few years, the defining traits of the FTA movement were as follows. And none of this holds anymore. So if I was giving a class, say, on trade issues, and I was going to talk about what are the characteristics of these preferential trade agreements, the first one is something that Professor Pereira already talked in great detail. And that is bilateralism, right? These were small one-to-one country negotiations. So the idea was that there's a very laborious way in which you actually go about opening market access because you go one at a time. But that's the way it was proceeding. Second, and this made the movement all the more puzzling, if you will, we were witnessing countries investing tremendous amount of resources in negotiating bilateral agreements to accomplish, quite frankly, very little. If you look at the overall share of exports that most of these trade agreements were covering. So for example, I got started with this analyzing the Japan-Mexico FTA. And this was very impressive because I was doing it, but it covered 1% of Japanese exports went to Mexico. And nevertheless, you had these very involved negotiations. So it was a really interesting phenomenon to try to explain, but overall, you were not talking about trade agreements that were opening very large markets. And another very important characteristic of the FTA movement in the last 10 or 15 years was the North-South component. So frequently you had bilateral negotiations between an industrialized country and a developing nation. So those were the main traits: bilaterals, small export share covered, and North-South component to it. What I'm going to be talking about today is very different. We're now talking about trade agreements that bring together countries that put together represent a very sizable share of world GDP. I have listed some examples in my graph. For example, you have the TPP, now with Japan on board, almost 40% of world GDP. The RCEP, a third of world GDP. The Japan-EU FTA, 34% of world GDP. And the US-Europe, the so-called TTIP, and I'm not sure I like that acronym very much, the TTIP, 46% of world GDP, and I forgot to put in the graph the trilateral China, Japan, Korea FTA, but that's also very large because you have the second and third largest economy in the world. So, I remember when I started in this business, people would ask me the so what question. I don't get that anymore. It's very evident that we're talking about a big, big development here. The second shift, I argue, is that now we're seeing industrialized nations sitting across each other in a negotiation table. So now you have Japan and the European Union, you have Japan and the United States in the TPP context, and of course you have the United States and Europe. And this is something very new. And this is also very important to realize, because in the past we expected that perhaps the industrialized country, which had the most developed regulatory standards, would become the point of convergence. It is not that evident anymore, because all these industrialized countries make the case that they have the best regulatory approach. And then this brings me to another point that's very important in this latest stage in the FTA movement. And I think that we're witnessing the further consolidation in this shift of the trade agenda towards what I like to call deep integration. Trade policy has become increasingly complicated because we all know very well that it's no longer about how you eliminate tariffs, what happens at the border. That has shifted. And the real focus of negotiation is on behind the border issues. The intellectual property, competition policy, services, investment, you name it. And the point is that the list keeps growing. And I think that we have to understand that the substance of trade negotiations today is about how you harmonize, how you reform regulatory measures that are now considered to be the obstacles to market access, the obstacles to more streamlined, integrated world economy. And this makes trade policy incredibly controversial, because many of these regulations are in place to address issues such as environmental protection, public health, and so forth. But it could also be that these regulations are in place with the attempt to try to keep foreign producers out. And therefore, we're giving now our trade negotiators the very difficult task, and I certainly do not envy them, to try to make that determination. Which of these so-called regulatory measures are non-tariff barriers and are there with the intent to discriminate? And which ones are there for the very legitimate purpose of accomplishing these social objectives? And you can understand why trade policy today generates so much more response from civil society, because not everybody agrees to how these issues are defined as subject to international integration and coordination. And lastly, let me tell you why I think this new trend in trade politics is so interesting. Because I think that we're now asking ourselves, especially with the TPP and the TTIP, where these trans-regional trade agreements could now become the vehicle to really accomplish that deep integration agenda. We know that the multilateral route is not working very well. We have the inconclusive Doha round, no end in sight. And we also know that when we tried the bilaterals, the small bilaterals, we accomplished very little. And now what we have is this other option of large scale. We have now very sizable markets at stake, 30%, 45% of world GDP, attempting deep integration. And this is what's unfolding today. Now, I think that when we think about this, I think there are a number of opportunities and challenges. And here it's important, what I want to emphasize here is not the mega FTA notion, which I already described, but the fact that these are concurrent negotiations. Never before have we had so many important negotiations occurring at the same time. There have been important trade agreements in the past. NAFTA was one, the CORS, FTA, and so forth. But we have not had these mega trade agreements covering so many regions of the world occurring at the same time. And I think this presents both opportunities and challenges. So what are the opportunities? If everything goes well, I think that hopefully we could see a race to the top effect. And the idea here is that, highlighting again the competition element that Dr. Terada was referring to, that we couldn't have competition towards achieving higher quality trade integration. And I think this could take place in two ways. One is that competing trade groupings would have an incentive to aim higher because they want to remain attractive as places for investment, as places for business. They want to become important international trade hubs. So if one trade grouping gets ahead in raising its standards, hopefully that will create an incentive for others to try to increase the level of the ambition of the trade liberalization effort. But also I think this could take place through what are overlapping memberships. And this is a very important fact. We're not seeing the emergence of isolated, self-contained regional blocs. Thank goodness. There's actually a lot of overlap in membership. And this means that when some country in one negotiation, say Vietnam, accepts very high level of liberalization, then it might not be so hard to consider doing that in other trade negotiations. And that becomes a transmission belt, if you will, for deeper integration. Now, there are challenges too. One, I think, is, of course, that we may be scattering the negotiation resources of countries because they're partaking in so many large-scale negotiations. And I think this is a very, very important concern for many countries. Here in the United States, we have the sequester. And there have actually been, in the press, allusions to the fact that the USTR's travel budget is very much constrained at a time when it's actually the busiest. It has never been engaged in so many different negotiation fronts. Now imagine what the burden is for a developing country that does not have the same amount of bureaucratic resources that large industrialized countries do. How do they make sure that they can cover all these trade negotiations is an important concern. I think it's also important that what we may end up having is a very imbalanced level of attention. So we all know, for example, that Japan sent a very mighty delegation to the TPP, 150 or so highly trained bureaucrats, but there's no such delegation of equal size to match the other negotiations that Japan is participating. Resources are finite, so therefore important trade-offs exist. And I think also we have to ask ourselves, in this area of mega trade agreements, what does that mean for the future of the WTO? I want to be very clear that I think that the WTO is here to stay, that it has actually made great accomplishments in moving forward the liberalization agenda in the post-war period. I think that it has a very robust dispute settlement mechanism that countries resort to. It's a very well-tested mechanism. So WTO has its own reason for remaining. But I think that the question is, the WTO cannot become the arena to negotiate the next round of trade and investment rules. What will be the consequences of that? I remember a few years ago talking to a Japanese diplomat. He made the remark that if large industrialized countries ever began to negotiate trade agreements amongst themselves, that is the situation of today, that he felt that that would end up eclipsing the WTO. And I think that we shouldn't think that, it is the mega trade agreements who could harm the WTO. I see them more as a symptom of the malaise in the negotiation process in the WTO, but nevertheless, it does create question marks about the future of the multilateral trade system. Now let me move on to the TPP and the opportunities for US-Japan collaboration. I think that without a doubt, the TPP is the precursor to this new wave of mega trade agreements. This has been the central component of the Obama administration's trade policy. If you look at the beginning of the Obama administration, the first Obama administration, actually trade policy was not very ambitious, right? And rightly so. It was the onset of the global financial crisis, there were many pressing issues, and therefore it did not start with a huge bang. But how much has this changed? Now you don't only have the TPP, now you have negotiations with Europe, you have a services agreement at the WTO, and so forth. And once the Obama administration decided to join the TPP, then of course the significance of this trade agreement grew quite rapidly. And this then tells you about the path of expansion of the TPP. When it was just 9, then it became 11, and now with Japan at 12. And I think that that graph also highlights the risk of bilateralism that Dr. Pillay was talking about, in the sense that the United States and Japan do loom very large within the TPP negotiations just by the sheer size of their economies. But the importance of the TPP goes beyond the expansion in members. This is very important. I don't want to minimize it. But I think it also tells us about what are the fundamental goals of American trade policy today. I think that, before I actually, let me go to that and then I'll come back to this. I think that for the American government, it has been very important as a vehicle for rulemaking for the 21st century. I think it's important to realize that when the United States was pursuing bilateral agreements in East Asia, there was a moment of time of concern that it was not gaining traction. The United States succeeded in negotiating with Singapore and Australia, but actually negotiations with Malaysia and Thailand ended nowhere because of the very significant disagreements at the negotiation table. And the concern was that the FTA template that the American government pursues might not be finding resonance in the region. And that's when the Americans identified the P4 agreement that brought together 4 countries that you usually would not think of as a natural set of countries to come together: Chile, Brunei, New Zealand, and Singapore. But these countries shared this commitment to a very ambitious liberalization, and in that sense there was great compatibility with what the United States was attempting to do. So I think it's very important when we understand what was the original American interest in the TPP, first of all, to not be a player in the sidelines of regional integration in the most dynamic region in the world. Second, to have the opportunity to become an architect, a shaper of the standards for trade and investment in the 21st century economy. And you know, the TPP has generated a lot of interest because it's very different from other from other trade negotiations. And let me go back to this table very quickly. First of all, because it had been very common for the other FTAs to make lots of exclusions. And the TPP immediately caught the attention of everybody by saying, we will not tolerate sexual exclusions. Everything has to be put on the table. So immediately this shifted the level of ambition. And second, because it does attempt to go very deeply in the non-tariff measures, and therefore there's so many chapters that deal with, for example, disciplines for state-owned enterprises, environmental and labor standards that Professor Pena will discuss, regulatory coherence, competition policy, the digital economy, patents for pharmaceuticals, and the list goes on and on. And I think what's really important here that also sets the TPP apart is that it has this open accession vision. Because so many other trade agreements become self-centered, they don't expand, they don't look for new members, and the idea here always has been that the end goal is to produce an Asia-Pacific template. Now, for the United States to achieve these objectives, Japan's coming on board has been of great importance. First of all, let me just highlight some of the benefits for the United States. It has quite simply transformed the importance, the economic importance, the gains from trade that the United States stands to gain from these negotiations. Basically, it tripled the economic benefits. Why? Because of the size of the Japanese economy, and second, because there was no pre-existing trade agreement between Japan and the United States. So we're talking about fresh gains from trade. I think it's also important because it does consolidate the Asian credentials of the TPP. It used to be the case that skeptics would say, well, the TPP talks about Asia-Pacific integration, but it does not have yet one of the largest Asian economies on board. Japan is now there. So that criticism has been taken care of. And finally, because I think, you know, in the headlines, we always hear about disagreements, but then we lose sight of the potential, the great potential for teaming up, because there's a commonality of interest in the rules area of the negotiations. The United States and Japan are on the same side of the issue in many areas when we talk about the rules negotiation of the TPP. Now, for Japan, the TPP has been a key, the key, I would make the case, trade negotiation. It has been an elusive goal. Japan has been chasing TPP membership, was chasing it for a couple of years. And I think there were very good reasons why the government saw in the TPP a really important opportunity. It was not too long ago, before Japan was in the TPP, that the tone of my presentation on Japan's trade policy was completely different. There was not the excitement about the range of possibilities that Japan has today. The main thing then was that Japan could become marginalized from the most important trade negotiations going on. There was a real concern that Japan, because of its own domestic politics, would not be able to say we want to be part of this. And I think that, therefore, coming into the TPP, this helped dispel this gloom about the future of Japan, the second largest economy, of playing in the big leagues of trade negotiations. I think it's also very important that through the TPP, it was possible to level the playing field for many Japanese companies who were competing, for example, with Korean companies that had better terms of access because Korea had negotiated more nimbly, more ambitiously before Japan did. This is a point I'm going to highlight. Nearly 3 minutes? Oh my goodness. I have to then rush because I'm taking too long. But The other thing that the TPP membership did for Japan is that it energized its trade diplomacy. And I just finished a paper with Saori Katala where we talk about Japan as a pivotal state. Who would have thought this possible? Pivotal state in trade negotiations. And we trace the regional reactions to Japan's TPP membership. And it's really interesting to see that China, for example, decided to speed up the feasibility study and then launch the trilateral China-Japan trade agreement, and also agreed to the membership configuration that gave rise to the regional comprehensive economic partnership. But I want to emphasize here the one issue. The TPP, I think, is very important because it will allow Japan to make much more progress in its very important agenda of economic revitalization and structural reform. So because my time is short, let me then jump to this discussion. I think that, there are many areas in which we can think of the TPP helping Japan achieve this economic reform agenda, and one of them is agricultural reform. I think that we all know what Japanese agriculture needs, right? I mean, we would like to see, for example, a next generation of full-time farmers that can engage in larger scale production and also to encourage commercial farming. If you look at the demographics of Japanese farming today, and I'm mostly talking about rice because the situation on vegetables and fruits is very different. But if we look at this core commodity in Japanese trade politics, rice, demographically, it's a very difficult situation. You know that 50% of Japanese farmers are over the age of 70. Only 8% are under the age of 50. The scale of production is minuscule. And the government is running a program whereby in order to keep producer prices high, it actually sets aside 30% of the paddy land and then cannot be used for production. So it's a system where the Japanese agricultural future seems very dire. And I think we all understand what kind of policies would give a brighter future to Japanese agriculture. First of all, to end the set-aside program, to ease land restrictions so that you can have private corporations come in, and to create incentives for a younger generation to join agriculture, and of course to also reform the income compensation program. And I'm going to say something here that might not be very popular, but in this one area, as to how you tailor the income compensation program to gain acquiescence for trade reform, Japan actually should look at the Korean example. Korea has very cleverly devised an income compensation program that's attached to, for example, this chorus FTA, whereby it was able to overcome the opposition of farmers thanks to this subsidy. Now, the problem was that the growth strategy that Japan released in June did not really cover these central issues in the agricultural reform. And I think that therefore, once the TPP negotiations move forward, and Japan is pressed to make more commitments in opening its agricultural markets, then the stimulus will come to precisely put these very important policies in the table, because it will become imperative to reduce prices and increase productivity. And the way to get there is by addressing these very important reform measures. I also would like to make the point that I think that over time there's been a shift in Japan on the relationship between trade liberalization and agricultural reform. And I would like to, I think there are like three different stages. One is when Japan first launched its trade FTA diplomacy. I think that from the day one, advocates of FTAs in Japan wanted to use these trade agreements to promote agricultural reform. And the thinking there was that you have to go gradually. Yes, you would be negotiating with small trade partners, but you would be making holes in this wall of protection, and eventually you will fall. The problem is that that prediction did not materialize because the Japanese agricultural lobby very skillfully adapted to the FTA negotiation and basically said something like 800 tariff lines as off limits. Then there was a shift in the discussion, I believe, in Japan as to maybe we should first carry out agricultural reform as a precondition for Japan to being able to negotiate more ambitiously. So it was more of a domestic-driven reform effort that did not go very far. And I think then we are now asking ourselves if with this new approach, Japan participating in a mega trade agreement, where from the get-go the assumption is that everything has to be in the table, that only super sensitive sectors might consider some level of protection, where this would actually finally provide the stimulus for further reform. And the fact that now Japan is negotiating with very large agricultural exporters through the TPP. So I think the question there is if this new approach will make a difference, a dent, the way in which previous approaches could not. And then I think we also have to take into account not only agricultural reform, but structural reform. And I actually see a lot of convergence between the agenda for addressing non-tariff barriers that the European Union and the Americans are bringing to these negotiations and the domestic growth strategy of the government in the promotion of mergers and acquisitions, international standards, reforms to corporate governance, you name it. I think that there can be great progress in trying to increase foreign direct investment in Japan and internationalizing the service sector. So those would be huge payoffs from pursuing the domestic reform and the trade negotiations concurrently. But I think it's also important to realize that the TPP and the negotiations with Europe are not the be-all and end-all structural reform in Japan. There are many issues, many changes that need to be addressed in Japan that are not under the purview of these trade agreements. But that doesn't take away from the fact that these indeed could provide a very important stimulus for structural reform. I don't think I have to tell you how deeply the skepticism runs in this town about Japan's ability to undertake structural changes and tackle on vested interests. And I hear very frequently that Japan has tried structural reform before and never succeeded. But I think that we shouldn't think that because it didn't work in the past, there's absolutely no hope today. I think that the situation is not at all akin to, for example, when the United States and Japan were negotiating the Structural Impediments Initiative. I think qualitatively there are many differences on what these trade agreements represent for Japan today. First of all, because quite frankly, in the Structural Impediments Initiative, and I promise I'll finish very soon, Terada-san, because I see you looking at your watch. In the Structural Impediments, which is too polite to tell me, but I'm going to conclude very quickly. So in the Structural Impediments Initiative, you had these two countries negotiating bilaterally in a climate of very stiff trade friction and under the shadow of trade sanctions to Section 301. This is not at all what's going on today. First of all, because Japan has sought out to be in the negotiations with the European Union and with the United States because it sees a key link to its attempts to reform its economy, achieve greater international competitiveness, and get better access in overseas markets. So the incentive structure, the calculus for Japan is very different today. And therefore, I think that we cannot yet say if this is going to succeed, but we cannot say that because it has not worked in the past, we're condemned to never see a future in this front. And as I said, summing up, going back to the question that was posed as the running theme of this panel, how can Japan and the United States manage multiple FTAs to promote prosperity? I want to emphasize the potential role of bridge countries. That is, countries that are participating in multiple mega trade agreements. The United States is one, because it's negotiating with Pacific countries and Atlantic countries, and Japan is one, because it's negotiating in the TPP and in the RCEP. And I think it's very important for these countries to aim not only for high-level realization, but as much as possible for common standards that can disseminate widely. We do not want idiosyncratic trade agreements whose rules only apply to member countries. The benefit of all these would be much greater to the extent to which, because these negotiations are simultaneously taking place, we can think of common approaches to most issues. I also think this is a golden opportunity to try to use the mega trade agreements to boost, to provide a tailwind for Japan's economic reform efforts. And I think it's very important. I think that the TPP has been very successful because it has an expansive vision, right? And the idea is that all APEC economies are welcome to apply. And I think that this spirit should be preserved. rules for the docking mechanism as to how new members will be brought on board are critical, how they're designed, and certainly that the message is out that there's an opportunity for any country that wants to use this trade agreement to enhance its international competitiveness should join. And that goes for South Korea, that goes for China, that goes for any other country who potentially could become a member of the TPP. Sorry I went so long. Thank you very much.
Very much, Mayor. Yeah, right.
I'd like to discuss some of the research results from the Institute of Japan-US Studies at Waseda University. Abenomics to promote macroeconomic stability with modest inflation and positive economic growth seems to have been working with collaborative efforts by the Bank of Japan for the past half a year. With this success in stimulus packages and growth-oriented policies and solid political foundation, the domestic support for the Abe administration seems to continue for a long term. The administration seems to consider the TPP as an opportunity for the continuation of positive economic growth in the long run in Japan. A challenge in the TPP negotiation for Japan as latecomer is to somehow come up with compromises from the negotiating partners, keeping promises done to the domestic interests, including the agriculture lobbies. Today, I'd like to discuss the issues related to some questions raised by Professor Terada at the beginning, based on academic studies done by our research group at the Institute of Japan-US Studies and the Waseda Organization for Japan-US Studies. The issues on the local rules versus global rules and TPP relations to regional comprehensive economic partnership, RCEP initiatives are covered in my talk. So how much extent that the RCEP negotiations will continue? Well, I will argue that with this Japanese participation to the TPP negotiations, RCEP negotiations to go faster than expected before. So first, I'd like to share my observation or just set up some assumption regarding my arguments. And the assumption is that rulemaking has been an important element of trade negotiations. We hear lots of market access issues in Japan, where rulemaking seems to be the core of the negotiations in these days, actually for the past 20 years or so in the multilateral negotiation areas. Even for the GATT-Bugoela negotiations in the area of agriculture and food, which was very active 20 years ago, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, we just call this one as SPS as abbreviation, was treated as important as the issues on market access and agriculture support 20 years ago. So for TPP discussions, we still hear much about how to improve market access and how to eliminate government interventions to the markets. However, it's it's very important to think of the rule makings in the negotiation tables. So here, I'd like to argue that rule making is important, and Japan and the US can make significant contributions and can obtain economic benefits by leading discussions on setting regional rules, which can be extended as global rules. The US has been very doing well in implementing or trying to introduce the US, sort of a US template, which I hear from the Chinese academicians and then today in discussions. However, Japan hasn't been so much good at leading the rule makings. So I think that Japan has room for making more significant contributions by leading the discussions in rule makings. In our team, our research team, we reviewed existing major FTAs signed by the US, European Union, and Keynes group of countries, exporting countries, to see how the global rules of the WTO are respected in the area of SPS, technical barriers to trade, TBT, and trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, TRIP, and geographical identification, GI, for agriculture and food products. In the case of SPS, we found that the US FTAs do not go beyond the global rules by WTO. So rules are followed, WTO rules are followed in the US FTAs. For the EU FTAs, not uniform approaches have been taken beyond the global rules. So we see very diversified agreements in this area among the EU-related FTAs. For Australia and New Zealand, from the Keynes group, the global rules are also respected. So we don't really see unique rules set particularly to specific FTAs in this area. However, in the case of GI, geographical identification, we see some different pictures. The protection is limited to wine in the EU-Chile FTA among agriculture and food products, while all agriculture and food products are covered under the GI measures for the EU-Korea FTA. Under the US and Chile FTA, geographical identification, GI, can be protected as trademarks. Existing trademarks are considered superior to GI measures. So FTAs in this area of GI, regional or bilateral FTAs cover more specific or rules beyond the global rule under the WTO. So if I summarize our findings or our observations, I have 4 observations. First 2 observations are here. First observation, which we found, is that local rules set by FTAs vary by partner. Flexibility in rules existing FTAs. So individual bilateral FTAs didn't really try introducing or coming up with a very much of a global rules. So bilateral FTAs have been quite flexible in terms of setting rules for the partners, among the partners. The second observation is here. Local rules set by the FTAs are placed by large partners. So the big economy tend to sort of set major rules. In the case of GI, US and EU efforts to extend their own approaches are observed. So EU has been very, in the case of agriculture and food products, EU has been really pushing hard for introducing GI rules. And the US has been more pushing for the introduction of, or the importance of trademarks rather than the introduction of GI measures. So this might create a conflict in domestic rules in some partner countries. Take the lead and then you will win seems to be a common belief and practice by major trade partners. There is an example of Korea, which signed trade agreements with the US and then EU in recent years. So some areas like a GI, Korea adopted quite different rules with the US and then with EU. And then domestic rules are not really, haven't been really adopted in these two different rules. So some experts call spaghetti ball situation. You sign international agreements and then you have to adjust your domestic rules to the international treaties. But if you have completely different approaches to the specific issues like GI, you come up with troubles in adjusting your domestic rules. So Korea signed agreements, but they are facing some domestic problems. So somehow signed countries should somehow compromise their domestic rules and come up with rules which meet the requirements by different international treaties. Here, third observation is that local rules set by FTAs often complement global WTO rules. The WTO rules are not really covering all the trading rules. And then, so some bilateral FTAs try to complement, try to fill the gaps between what the partners need and domestic, what the international WTO rules can do. And fourth, in case of trade disputes, prompt settlement through scientific examinations by experts are sought for minor issues. And then major issues are set to be settled through the WTO frameworks. So this type of arrangement we see in most of the bilateral FTAs. So for minor issues which can be potentially in disputes, two partners try to settle the issues quite quickly rather than going through the lengthy process of discussion through the WTO frameworks. Okay, so my argument is here, TPP can be considered as an upgraded version of individual FTAs, aiming to promote much larger partnerships and to achieve higher levels of market legalization than individual FTAs in the Asia-Pacific region. The ultimate goal for the global partnership in this Asia-Pacific region can be the establishment of free trade area by Asian-Pacific FTAAP under the APEC scheme. Professor Terada mentioned about this FTAAP. So TPP is under discussion now or negotiation, but our ultimate goal for this region could be to have a much greater trade partnership in this region through potentially through the APEC scheme. With the existence of missing opportunities, economic losses from non-participation in regional trade agreements, the negotiations for the RCEP is likely to make progress after observing active efforts to reach agreements through the TPP framework by important members, including China, for the outset initiatives. It is obvious from the viewpoint of economics, if you exclude some economic agent from the free economic activities, and then involved parties, partners, they benefit from that treaty, but excluded country will be negatively affected. So the ultimate goal for trade negotiations should be to establish a global partnership among all the existing countries. So the excluded country, such as potentially China at this moment, they will try not to be left out, not to get negative impacts of the seeing the regional trade agreements to be reached by the neighboring countries. Okay, I'm sorry. This is what I said. So China is also carefully observing how Vietnam and Malaysia are responding to the requests in TPP negotiations regarding the reformation of the state-owned enterprises. It is likely that the progress made for transatlantic trade and the investment partnership, TTIP, will stimulate the rule-making process for TPP, RCEP, and even for FTAs. Sure, this TPP is the framework for Asian Pacific region, but at the same time, US is involved with negotiation with EU, and then this will sort of stimulate the discussions regarding the rule-makings. European rules probably hard to accept for the US in some areas, and then having some rules set in for Asian Pacific regions, US might be able to get some positive impact in for the negotiation with the EU. Yeah. So this is my report from our studies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gamma. Well, we have 35 minutes more for Q&A sessions. So if you'd like to raise questions, maybe just microphone is just located in the center, and hopefully each speaker has one question each. And please identify yourself before that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the presentation. My name is George Mihayas. I'm from Finnish Partnership. I've been working for the last 30 years in Europe. Thank you very much for your trial with Dr. Solis. Because the acceleration of TTIP, the first meeting took place in July. Next meeting in Brussels in October, 8th of October. And there is an ambition, a determination to accelerate. Yet, there are many misunderstandings. And I've been following and interviewing. My question is, do you think, as an organizing, structuring, optimizing instrument for the triangle, US, EU, Japan, that we could go ahead with intellectual property rights, what I call knowledge economy? American economy, over 70% is IP-based, as far as I know. No, 40% production and 74% exports American economy, which means there's motivation. Japan has been late, and where it's very methodological, Japan has one handicap and one advantage. I take the advantage. In my experience of over 20 agreements between Europe and Japan, everyone, including the Japanese, underestimated the technological innovation, creativity potential of Japan. I can take very easily 10 examples and to tell you that we can create business in Europe and in US. Okay? So in that respect, Japan, everyone underestimates Japan, and Japan has been so far shy, I don't have a better word today, shy about what are you doing, how are you doing? So the language of international rules, principles, is in Japan rather early stage. It's not preschool, but it's not 12, high school level. So I'm challenging you because I was involved, I benefited a lot, and I do appreciate, and you have a lot of potential. Now, IP, I think, could be accelerated for many reasons. China indigenous innovation policy since 2006, we have the same problems, and also it addresses freedom, democracy, market rules, and so on. So, my question and challenge to you, could we think in order to organize our triangle, we don't wait for everything, but to handle as quickly as possible intellectual property rights, which includes of course copyrights and so on. It goes about freedom, democracy, business, and job creation. Last and not least, I've been working for the last 20 years with one of your governmental institutions in creating jobs in what we call knowledge economy. I don't have a better partner in the world, after working in quite a few countries, to provide me with understanding information technologies to show what skills we need, what jobs, and how we can create those jobs on what we call knowledge-based economy. We can elaborate on this. But I'm talking about audio, digital services, movie, and so on. Which is a big issue between Japan and America and Europe. So IP, creativity, entrepreneurship in this triangle, US, Japan, EU. Could we go ahead to have a special task force and maybe we solve a lot of problems in jobs and so on? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. If you have more questions, maybe we can accept, then ask the speakers and to answer some relevant questions. So please go ahead.
Aaron Webb, George Mason University. Nobody ever likes the person who brings up currency at trade discussions, because there isn't a stable ideological or academic framework to deal with it, but we should deal with it. We should discuss it at least a little bit, especially since we're talking about non-tariff trade liberalization that's going to have very small margins, be very politically tricky. Small changes in currency prices or overall destabilization like happened during the Asian currency crisis and seems relatively likely after the last economic crisis could in a moment swamp or dwarf gains made by even successful trade negotiations. So I guess the question is not whether we're dealing with it right now, but whether you see in this challenge to China, this deep integration, in this rules-making progress, a step forward to a time where we may be actually able to start discussing currency rules, discussing currency stabilization as a major item on the agenda. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yeah.
Scott Seaman with Eurasia Group. My question is, what do you think the chances are of the TPP concluding this year? What does concluding actually mean? What will it look like? And also, what key concessions Japan and US would need to make to make that conclusion happen?
Thank you very much. Maybe one more, if you think.
Tetsuya Toyoda, fellow at the Wilson International Center. And my question was not really relevant to the question asked so far. What's the place of Taiwan in the East Asian economy in the future? Well, Taiwan used to be the #1 partner of the US, but now almost no one speaks about Taiwan. So, APEC did have Taiwan as a member, but not the opposite. So, what will be the place for Taiwan in the future in this overall developing framework of regional economic cooperation? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. If not, maybe we could ask our panelists, maybe including myself, to answer questions. Maybe it is relevant to their own topics or presentations. No? One more? Okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Isobe from CSIS Japan Chair. I have a question about the U.S. domestic negotiations about TPP. I'm wondering if the administration could get a trade promotion authority from the Congress. I think it would be a significant issue to conclude TPP within this year. So it would be appreciated if you could give me the implications of this. Thank you.
Very much. It must be years. Okay, so who should start? Maybe Professor Gammaster and then this one.
I guess I could only discuss intellectual property right issues and then currency stabilization issues. This TPP, well, whether they can reach, come up with agreements that's sort of a political issue, and I'm not really good at analyzing the situations. Okay. Currently, I think under the TPP, issue of intellectual property rights discussed in the framework of developed economies versus developing countries. Developed countries with lots of property rights, they fear that their rights have been violated by the developing countries, like being copied. So trilateral intellectual property rights sort of agreements among Europe, US, and Japan sure could benefit and then could enhance the opportunities for the economies. However, issue or more benefits exist with agreements with developing countries. So broader partnership is a sort of required. So these three, these three major economies in the world economy have a mutual interest of diffusing their concepts of intellectual property rights. So in that sense, they can collaborate and then just come up with a more global partnership. And then, of course, these regional trade negotiations, including TPP and LCEP or APEC trade agreement, these will really contribute to make progress in this area. That's what I could sort of say. And then regarding the currency, well, introducing a regional currency in Asia or Pacific region, that could be a potential. But the benefits, well, in the case of EU, sure, smaller countries, now EU has 28 member countries, and then more than 10 countries share the same common currency. But then again, they face the financial crisis, partly because of just inability to control their own domestic economies. Just only they have a tool of a fiscal policy to, well, by the government. They don't have a control through the monetary policy. So it's not really beneficial aspect we observe through the EU experience. There are some negative sides. So probably ASEAN countries, these economies are still relatively small, and then they're trying to form a really free trade zone in 2 years. So they might be interested in considering such a currency union in the near future, because they benefit from this type of arrangement. Japanese currency, Chinese currency, these currencies become quite a significant currencies in the world market. So I'm not sure whether these economies are willing to give up this advantage to come up with regional currencies. In terms of controlling the economies, so sure, yes, they should discuss this, but the priority could be not that high at this moment for the region. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. This one? Yeah, thanks. So many great questions and so many issues on the table, so I'll try to address them quickly. This notion about the triangle, you have the industrialized countries, could you identify an area where they would have a shared interest, because these are countries that innovate, countries with strong rule of law, countries that therefore would aim for high level of intellectual protection. I think it's a very enticing proposition, but I would be worried about carving out that and not leaving that as part of the TPP. Why? Because I think we have to keep in mind a very important element of the negotiation dynamics, and that is the interaction between what gets negotiated in the rules area and what gets negotiated in the market access area. And there's a lot of quid pro quos going on. So many of the ways in which industrialized countries, i.e. the United States or Japan, could get ahead in intellectual property is by then making concessions on issues that developing countries care about, for example, Vietnam and textiles and yarn for women and so forth. So if you take that out, you're then eliminating the possibility of these cross-breeding and cross-sectoral or cross-issue beneficial elements for the negotiations. So I think that's why it's better to leave them put where they are and not to think of we just move forward where we all agree and we're a happy little club. I think it's important to get buy-in from developing countries if this is going to be a global standard. Then on the currency issue, I think that's a great question, and I agree that one of the factors that influences international trade is clearly the value of the currency. But that, in my mind, that does not mean that we should incorporate a currency clause in trade agreements. I actually just wrote an op-ed on this that appeared in the Hill, because there's been, as you know, in June, 230 lawmakers sent a letter saying that we want currency manipulation clause in the TPP. And I make the case that this actually could be very counterproductive. First of all, quite simply because conceptually, we don't really know what kinds of behaviors really count as currency manipulation. I mean, direct intervention in the exchange market, sure, but beyond that is a wide gray area. So for example, you're probably familiar that many in the automobile caucus in this country say that Japan's quantitative easing counts as currency manipulation without realizing that it's very similar to what the Fed does, and therefore it looks like a complete double standard. And then when countries keep, large amounts of foreign exchange reserves, that's also some consider that currency manipulation. But from a point of view of other countries that went through the Asian financial crisis, prudential financial management. So the idea is that if you're going to have trade sanctions attached to currency manipulation clause, absent that fundamental conceptual clarity as to what kind of behavior is to be prescribed or not, I think it's playing with fire. And we also should keep in mind that we're talking about a global issue, not one that just applies to 12 countries, even though they represent 40% of world GDP. It should move forward, I think, first and foremost through the IMF, and not start with the trade agreement, because I think what's driving this invitation to use trade sanctions, and we really first have to have that clear conceptual map as to when it's allowed to intervene and when it's not allowed to intervene. Then, Scott, thank you very much for that question as to when the TPP will conclude. There's no doubt if you hear what the USJI is saying and the message that they're bringing when they visit Japan, when they go to Brunei this year, right? I mean, that they have made a very forceful case that it has to be this year. I don't sit at the negotiation table, so this is just my impression. And I think that I'm not really sure that it can be done so quickly when you think about the outstanding issues. I ask, and I'm not going to give any names, but sometimes I ask people who are more involved in these negotiations, and I say, okay, you tell me that in 4 months you can bring it home, right? So can you give me an idea of what's going to be like the compromise on state-owned enterprises, on patents for pharmaceuticals, where the United States had not brought back a reviewed proposal after most countries did not like what they saw the first time around over a year ago? what's going to happen with environmental standards and what's going to happen with, I mean, and I don't, obviously they don't, not going to tell me their secret trade negotiation strategies, but the fact is that there's still very large outstanding issues. The fact is that, you know, negotiations over market access with Japan are just starting. The parallel mechanism to address non-tariff measures vis-a-vis Japan is just picking up. Now, that doesn't mean that they will not be able to claim they did something. Obviously, as I said to me, someone said to me, we're going to have a party in October. Yes, but as you were saying, party about what? So I don't want to do predictions because frequently I'm wrong, but it would seem hard to me to imagine that you can have full fleshed out market access, full text, and everybody signed up by the end of this year. I may be wrong. I know that's the central objective of the U.S. administration, but I see a lot of outstanding issues. I see problematic domestic processes in other TPP countries. So it's not just what goes on in the United States. In Malaysia, there's been recently more backlash against the TPP. Even in a country that has been at the forefront of trade negotiations like Chile, lately the dissenting voices are raising in volume. Australia has its own, election. I mean, so we cannot just assume that things can be wrapped up so quickly. But I may be wrong, and certainly I'm not privy to the negotiations, and there's wide room for error on my part. And then finally, the question on Trade Promotion Authority, I think that's a fundamental question. I also asked them, when I asked, if you want to finalize an agreement so quickly, then what's your thinking about what is the right sequence for Trade Promotion Authority? And what do you think about the discussion in Congress about what should be the next round of trade negotiation objectives? And one issue that comes up is currency manipulation, but also transparency. And there's some discussion as to whether the Congress is informed enough, is close enough to the negotiations. I find that this is a recurrent theme in any country these days. You look at Korean trade politics, that's a theme. You look at US politics. This issue of how you balance between confidentiality that allows for these high-stakes negotiations to move forward with the requirement, democratic requirement to keep legislators abreast of what's going on. It's a very difficult balancing act. So, I know that there is talk in Congress about getting the TPA bill going, but I also think that there is a lot of disagreement as to what should be the trade objectives. And I think that everybody understands that the stakes are really high when you have so many mega trade agreements moving in the pipeline. So I don't have a good answer for you. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Of course, the triangle or semi-OECD type of OECD FTA, it's by having the three biggest economies except China and the world. I did quite interesting. But one probably tricky issue taken from the rules of the WTO in terms of the FTAs is, as I mentioned in my presentation, developed countries tend to have a single undertaking approach. So in this case, market access liberalization, investment liberalization, and also service liberalization putting together. And we cannot pull it and do it separately. So realistically speaking, investment only liberalization could not probably possible and among the lines of the triangle FTAs. So in terms of the liberalization of the information technologies, I think WTO in this case is still quite important. You may know the 1997 ITA, Information Technology Agreement, and 7 countries actually liberalized, the IT-oriented, the products free, tax-free. And now they have the WTO try to upgrade the IT agreement, by inviting more people, also covering the quite a number of issues, because ITA was just signed 15, 16 years ago. But since then, the more technology has been advancing. So I think realistically speaking, in terms of the promoting the trade related to the IT products, I think the probably relying on the WTO rather than the TPP on other issues could be more realistic, it seems to me. And also investment treatment now has quite the touchy agenda in TPP, ISDS, investor state dispute settlement, and Australia has been strongly opposed to it. And I don't know whether the US can and Australia can make a compromise. And in this case, Japan has been, it seems to be supportive of ISDS because Japan's bilateral FTAs so far has, except for one, but has ISDS approaches. So I think it's not necessarily difficult for Japan to support the US views, but the Australia is very starkly against, particularly after experiencing I think one of the tobacco companies suited Australian government and in terms of the advertisement on tobacco. So I think well, I'm not so sure about this. This means the investment agreement has a lot of different issues, and we needed to promote all of them to have agreement. So I think, realistically speaking, it's quite unrealistic to pick up the one specific issues to make a conclusion. Well, currency is also the very significant issue. Again, from politics viewpoint, the ASEAN needs to set up first. Otherwise, there would be no way for the East Asian countries to have a current common currencies, currency stabilization schemes. But ASEAN proposal has never actually picked up this kind of approaches. Again, private sector, think tanks propose for the ASEAN single currency system, etc. But it seems to be the government has never shown interest in realizing it, partly because the ASEAN nations and some of the East Asian countries have been more interested in expanding the so-called SOP agreement, particularly to prepare for their own currencies, devaluating quite sharply, just because of the 1997 Asian finance crisis experiences. So in this case, ASEAN Plus 3, which now has given up the trade liberalization agenda because it's relegated to the agenda to the RCP, has been more focused upon this, the currency cooperation. I mean, Chen mentioned the multilateralizations. And if you look at every year ASEAN Plus finance ministers meetings, we have always upgraded the schemes for helping the countries whose currencies will be sharply devaluated. Well, this year, China, Koreans political problems, and Korea, China didn't dispatch any finance ministers and central government leaders. So there was no actually first time, as far as I know, no concrete agendas realized by Japan. Now ASEAN has set up the bilateral SOP agreement with the individual countries, while China and South Korea has been more engaged in bilateral SOP agreement by themselves. I think it's certainly affected by the political situations in Northeast Asia. TPP, whether it can be concluded or not, I don't know, to be frank. But when it comes to the bilateral market access, which I just focused on in my presentations, a reason why US quite strongly pushed the bilateral approaches rather than the common custom ratio approaches, something like that, unlike the East Asian cases, is actually it's much easier. US can pick up and then propose to the member countries, and how about you? Okay, you can do it, okay, maybe we should eliminate, which we are not necessarily interested in liberalizing. If covering 90%, it can be consistent with Article 24, that's fine. But there are a number of issues which are quite strongly contested. One of the issues is, for example, competition policy. Even there is no clear definition of the state-owned companies, for example. And certainly Malaysia, Vietnam, even Japan, we have state-owned companies as well. Have sort of worried about the Americans and approaches to the state-owned companies in a TPP agreement. And again, there's no information released. But however, as far as I read the newspapers in Japan, there's no such kind of progress at all. And it seems to me it will never probably progressing this year either. But I don't know. Just as we said, it's simply negotiated among themselves. But upon it, just picking the market access, and there might be possible, but there would be much concessions on part of the US. Taiwan. Interesting, I was invited by one of the Taiwanese universities to leader integration conferences 3 months ago, maybe 2 months ago. Also, this was organized by university. But interesting, when I went to there was a Taiwanese foreign minister and a lot of foreign officers there. They're huge conferences. And again, this sort of Taiwanese approach it looks like an academic conference. But if you look at the participants, again, they're all offshoots to get the information from the non-governmental participants like myself. And again, Taiwan is qualified to join TPP because it's an APEC member. And but of course, politically speaking, it is very difficult. But interestingly, Taiwanese foreign minister just mentioned to me at that time in a conference that we are more interested in concluding bilateral FTAs first. Of course, it has China now, and more liberalizing, covering even services. That's a very interesting case. But now New Zealand and Singapore, bilateral FTA with Taiwan, has been rumored to be concluding, I don't know, sometime next year. Then probably having more bilateral FTAs under the Chinese, and circumstance at which China has been worried looking at. I don't believe Taiwan will start a negotiation with Japan, for example. That would be too much politically sensitive. But once Taiwan joined the TPP, it's more multilateral. So in this case, such a political issues or animosity that China carries against Japan might be mitigated. But again, it's relatively theoretical. But again, as far as I know, Taiwan is currently more exclusively interested in bilaterals. And after seeing New Zealand and Singapore one, then we can probably see how Taiwan will be reacting. The PS, sorry, I'm not American, so maybe I just give it to me. I have no idea on that, sorry. Okay, we have 7 minutes more. Probably we can accept 1-2 questions if you right. Yeah, please come forward.
Thank you. I'm Jimmy Wen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. Would you discuss the RCEP and also the pro and cons between RCEP and TPP? Would RCEP undermine TPP in the Southeast Asia and in East Asia? Because it seems like it's easier, lower standard, and it's easier in practice for many Asian countries. And also, there's rumors, or I don't know, it has happened that the BRICS and other Asian countries during this time is talking about forming another group that subsidize the Asian countries in trading, a form of IMF, but for Asian countries. Yeah, and a few other Asian countries. I think Japan is one, I'm not sure. I was told that it would be discussed among this time, at the same time with the G20. So I don't know if you know about it and what you're thinking about it, whether not a currency. Instead of not a currency.
Very much. No? One more, if you like. You want
Further to this question, I think between Europe and the US, they are about to stumble very likely about movies, French movies, cultural exception, and so on. My understanding, I'm a member of UNESCO Task Force in terms of cultural heritage, there's a lack of understanding. We don't know what this business is all about really. The Americans are subsidizing at least as much beyond Hollywood movie making. And this is an explosive business. Another teasing question, if I may, why not to take this cultural creative industry, specifically movie industry, audiovisual services, to conduct a very thorough study? What this is all about? Before we start negotiations. What I witnessed in Europe the last 2 months, 3 months, I mean, they can't negotiate. They discuss about things unrelated. So my question is, could we have movies, like audiovisual services, to look into this? Social impact, economic impact, political impact, and so on. And here IP copyrights are very important. So as a basic fundamental studies first. I learned very much from Japan in this respect, and we don't know, neither in America nor in Europe, a lot of work which has been done. So I think we can learn a few things. Thank you.
Very much. Okay, well, finishing, so let us answer the question first. Maybe for trading fairly, maybe I should start, then going towards the well, sorry, I have no idea about the movie industry, so I'm not qualified to answer on that. On RCEP, it is easier than TPP. I think so. Sorry, I just described in tables. RCEP has only 8 items at the moment. It might be increased later on. And also single undertaking or gradual approach in other forms, still RCEP has not decided yet, but according to the modalities, they actually indicated all of the possibilities. So maybe non-single undertaking. So in this case, trade market access liberalization, market access negotiations done, then going into the next. That's much more actually easier, but time consuming, I have to say. Also, the sensitivities. This word has been highlighted in RCP documents as well as CJK. But I haven't seen this kind of sensitivities or flexibilities, have not seen in TPPs. So I think this is quite the big difference compared with TPP and other regional institutions which I picked up. So it may be true, the RCEP might be concluded first, but still Japan, as a developed country like Australia, wants to RCEP as similar possible to the TPPs in agendas. So it may be possible that the developed countries might push the non-tariff barriers, for example, and etc. Harder in RCEP frameworks, to make RCEP itself more utilizable by the MNS multinational companies. Well, BRICS, well, what I know is BRICS actually decided to set up its own bank, BRICS Bank, and interestingly using their own currencies to finance the developing countries with longer terms, with a lower interest compared with the World Bank. And again, they try not to use US dollars. So I think BRICS might be considered to be a challenge to the so-called Washington consensus set up by the IMF, the World Bank here in Washington, D.C. And this was clearly mentioned in BRICS summit declaration last year and even this year. So my speculation is actually China has been quite pushing this hard, as well as India. I'm not so sure about Brazil and Russia in setting up the BRICS banks. But if you look at the Chinese and the remarks on East Asian Financial Corporation, it was clearly connected to the global financial governance reforms like IMF. And BRICS declaration also touched upon the necessity of changing the traditions, appointing Europeans to the IMF governance and Americans to the World Bank president. They're also appealing to the world this kind of the tradition, not based upon any legal, the framework should be changed. So I think BRICS can be, any framework can be probably utilized for realizing this kind of the emerging economy's interest in the global, particular finance governance. But again, I have to say, BRICS, the networks is very fragile. If you look at the trade, there's not any bilateral FTA among themselves. Trade issues are simply overlooked. So it seems to me only finance, and particularly challenging IMF, World Bank, is probably one of the only few realistic issues BRICS wants to promote. But I'm not so sure about BRICS linkages with East Asia. because Japan is there, Korea is there, and in this case, it's all developed countries with very strong connections with the United States. Whether we accept such BRICS, the norms or not, it's another question we have to consider. I doubt actually. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just want to pick up on the question about the relationship between TPP and RCEP, because I think it's a very interesting point to make. Sure, I think that RCEP is going to be easier to negotiate. The flexibility principle is embedded in everything that RCEP does. Special and differential treatment, the development gaps will be factored in, and it's much narrower in its scope. So in a sense, you could say, well, those negotiations will be easier, they'll follow the well-established ASEAN way. Will they be able to conclude in that way sort of steal the thunder of the TPP or not? I don't see it playing out that way. I think that, first of all, because they're so different, they're trying to accomplish different things. I think that the incentive will still be for many countries in RCEP to still continue with the TPP negotiations, because they can get a very different kind of market access to the TPP that they will be able to get from RCEP. And I'm actually now just finishing up a paper, for example, where I discuss whether it would be a good idea for South Korea to join the TPP or not. And I make the case that it does, even with chorus on hand. There's many things that Korea can achieve through the TPP membership, even though it's participating in RCEP. And let me give you one example. Japan and Korea attempted to negotiate a bilateral trade agreement in 2003, came to nothing. And if you see what were the complaints on the Korean side was the lack of agricultural liberalization in Japan, and from the point of view, far-ranging non-tariff measures that prevented their access into the Japanese market. Well, those are things that Japan has now agreed to negotiate on in TPP, but they're not going to be at that level of ambition in RCEP by any means. So I think that if South Korea wanted more in-depth access to the Japanese market, the route is TPP and not RCEP. We should also keep in mind that RCEP brings together countries in a very complex region where geography, history, territorial frictions and so forth can keep them apart. And that could also factor in the way in which the negotiations unfold. I think that so far, thankfully, there's been an effort to move forward with the trilateral, with the RCEP, and not let these territorial and historical issues step on the way. But we have to imagine that even with a flexibility approach, a time will come when difficult negotiations will be left and you will need intervention, high-level political intervention. Will the political capital be there to wrap these negotiations if these, in this climate of sometimes friction in the region? That's also a question mark for RCEP. And the way I like to think about it, and I frequently make this case when I talk about trade agreements, is that we're not talking about alliances in the sense that you are with me or against me. And the country, what I want to highlight is that there's a significant level of overlap in the membership. So I think it's a very healthy thing to have multiple trade agreements if this produces what I referred to in your presentation, a race to the top, in the sense of trying to then go for higher quality liberalization efforts. Thank you.
Regarding the intellectual property act, I didn't look into the literature in this area, but probably lack of knowledge in this area might exist. So before really making any efforts to negotiate or come up with some agreements, of course we need to understand the situation and then simulate to see the economic benefits and costs of coming up with international agreements in this area, among these major economies.
Thank you very much. Well, now it's 4:05. We're sorry to make the session over. Oh, sorry, my voice is Japan. I haven't adjusted yet. Sorry, it's in Japan 4 o'clock in the morning. Yes, sorry about that. Well, again, just on behalf of the Brookings and those who just, I'd like to express my gratitude to all of you who actually patiently staying and to listen to our presentations. again, USJI Week has been organized twice in a year, and to pick up the the important issues and concerning US and Japan, and again, your opinions are quite significant. And so, if you'd like to, ask the USJI to deal with any issue that will be welcome. So please send the email to maybe Professor Uchida. And for probably organizing USJI seminar more attractive. And in this case, your cooperation will be highly, highly appreciated. Once again, thank you very much for your participation.